Well, good morning. My name's Dave Wall. Welcome to the webinar series, episode number 2. Today we'll be discussing how to successfully launch and grow an on-demand service. I'm joined here today with my good friend Ben. Welcome, Ben. Good to see you back here.
Oh, it's good to be back here again with everyone.
Right, so just a quick recap. In case you missed episode number 1, it is available for playback. There were some very interesting topics that we covered off, from use cases through to designing a service, selecting the appropriate fares, etc., etc. It is available for playback, so if you didn't get the chance to see that, I encourage you to do so. Moving to the agenda today, we have quite a packed agenda, so we'll move straight into it. Today's agenda, we're going to cover off choosing the right vehicle and the right driver for an on-demand service. We'll be covering fares and fare promotions, how to successfully launch an on-demand service, which is a very critical part of the whole journey, promotion, marketing activities, monitoring and calibrating the service once it's launched, which again is also very important. And then we'll be wrapping it up at the end. So with no further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Ben, and we'll kick straight into selecting the right vehicle.
Fantastic, thanks, Dave. This is a common question I get asked a lot of times, Dave, which is, if I'm going to do an on-demand service, what is the right vehicle? Unfortunately, there's no easy answer. People say, oh, what's the right vehicle? And they're waiting for me to tell them it's this one. It depends on the service, and again, it depends on the goals and what you're trying to achieve. But there's some principles that I can walk you through that are going to really help you make that right decision. So let's look at the first thing. One of the first things you need to look at is vehicle capacity. And if you recall back in episode 1, we talked about having the right number of vehicles. Now that is important, but obviously the number of seats in the vehicle is also important. Now, when we talk about on-demand services, we're probably talking about, generally speaking, a vehicle that's going to need between, say, 8 to 14 or so seats. It's not going to be too often that you're going to need more than 14 seats, because you imagine going around and picking up potentially 14 different individual people from different places. If you were the person that got on first, that's a really long ride. That's not a great experience. So the capacity kind of starts to go away in terms of what you need the higher up you go. You'll see the vehicle that we've got pictured there is a Mercedes. That's an 8-seater Vito. Another one that we see quite commonly in our jurisdictions is the Mercedes Sprinter. That's a 13-seater, and it has a lot of benefits to it because it's that maneuverability of the vehicle. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you're a driver trying to get into narrow streets with cars parked on both sides, or a dead-end cul-de-sac street, you want to be able to move that vehicle easily. Something else that you should be taking into consideration is, I guess, the accessibility of it in terms of wheelchair capacity. So oftentimes, traditional route services require all vehicles to be wheelchair accessible. Now, we don't need that with on-demand services, because a book service means when someone books it and they request a wheelchair accessible vehicle, we send the appropriate one to that person. Now, that means that in general, we only need about 30% of our entire fleet to actually be wheelchair accessible to meet 100% of the demand that comes through in a very efficient and effective way. It's one of the benefits of on-demand services. Another consideration that plays into this, as well as each country can have different rules and regulations around size of vehicles. So like here in Australia, for example, a number of the states have rules around the size of the vehicle and which ones will end up incurring an additional, I guess, fee or levy. Say in New South Wales, if you're in a vehicle which has 12 seats or less, then you're going to end up with a $1 levy that will get attached to it, which means that oftentimes a vehicle with 13 seats or more is preferred because you avoid that levy. In addition, and this probably goes for many jurisdictions in the world, it's to do with seat belts, that the seating capacity of a vehicle will determine whether you need to have seat belts in the vehicle or whether young children need to be in approved child restraint. So again, with on-demand public transport services in particular, you want to take those things into account, because a smaller vehicle, while it might be advantageous for some reasons, if you can't take a mum with her 2 small kids without the need for you to have car seats or for mum to bring it along, it's just not ideal. So again, there can be a push towards larger vehicles, because generally speaking, they'll cover more bases. But again, you don't want to go too big, because then you lose maneuverability as well. So those are some things to take into consideration when choosing a vehicle. Another thing that's probably worth thinking about is that we have the advent of electric vehicles are becoming more and more common, as well as we're starting to see the beginnings of autonomous vehicles. VIA's got experience. One of our biggest deployments globally over in Europe uses half of the vehicles of 150 vehicle deployment, which are electric. And we take into account things such as where those vehicles will go to recharge, where demand will be, to make sure we actually situate those electrical vehicles in the appropriate places. So those are some things to take into consideration when we're talking about vehicles. But as we know, vehicles aren't going anywhere by themselves, so we need some drivers. And I can't overemphasize enough the importance of having really great drivers. Now, I don't mean that you're going to go and hire Lewis Hamilton or Scott McLaughlin to be your driver. We're not talking about that type of greatness. We're really talking about a customer-focused type of greatness. The driver is going to be the face of your service. And while there's lots of important things, I don't think anything's more important than having a smiling face for our customers to be greeted by when they get on board the service, particularly for new customers. It's great because it allows the driver can greet the customer by name. They're going to know where they're going to. It creates a bit more of a personal experience, but you need a great driver to do that. I remember when I was with Transport for New South Wales, we would do customer satisfaction surveys every 6 months for our 22 pilots. And whenever we would look at to understand why customers love the service, the number one reason, with only a few exceptions, was actually the driver. They loved them. It was that personal experience that they were getting. The exception that I just mentioned is actually when there was no extra effort put on to those drivers from a customer-centric point of view. And so they were getting, you might say, unfortunately, sometimes a bit of a typical public transport experience with their driver, and so it didn't resonate as strongly.
Ben, I've got a question that's just come through from Sarah, and she's asking for your perspective on using bus drivers as part of an on-demand service and whether or not that's an effective way to, from a driver perspective.
Yeah, there's a few ways to tackle it. I mean, I always think that bus drivers are amazing. They do so many different things. They're a driver, they're collecting fares, they're talking to customers, sometimes they're dealing with unruly children. You know, there's a lot going on, and they do a great job. What I'd say with bus drivers is if you're going to use your current fleet, your current, I guess, group of bus drivers, make sure you're a bit picky and choosy, that you've got the ones with the big smiling faces and great at interacting with customers, and then also train them, provide that extra assistance. Because one thing I didn't mention was the importance of them being really understanding the technology from the customer's point of view, because it's that customer who maybe doesn't understand how to use the app, or maybe is having a bit of problems on what's the right payment method to be using, or how do I select booking for 2 people. Your driver is going to be the one that will be explaining them how to do that. So they need to be well versed from a customer point of view, but also a technology point of view. And so yes, you can use your current group of drivers. You might choose to go out and hire some new drivers as well, specifically with that type of skill set. You might use some contractor drivers as well. So there's no one right way, but definitely the principle is make sure you arm them with customer service skills and a really strong understanding of the technology from the customer's point of view. So look, now we've talked a little bit about vehicles and drivers. Let's talk about something else that is important, which is what's the appropriate fare for an on-demand service? I'm going to break this down to 2 general areas. One is talking about from the public transport point of view, and the other one is more from maybe more of a private or commercial point of view. Although you'll see that many of the principles do go across both of these areas. The first thing I'd say is from a public transport point of view is that if you want the public to accept this as public transport, you have to price it accordingly. You know, the public's pretty smart. If you try and tell them it's public transport, but then price it at a much higher rate than traditional public transport, you'll send a mixed message, and you're just not going to get the take up that you would otherwise be getting if you priced it accordingly. But it's also about understanding what some of your I guess, purposes are about maximizing patronage. Are you trying to go for a lower cost per trip? These things need to get taken into account because fares influence behavior, and they can be used to get the behavior that you're after. Using distance-based fares is a really good way of achieving the behavior that you want, because we might want to encourage people to go to, say, the closest train station rather than another alternate train station that might be better off for them as an individual, but actually creates pressure on the service. So distance-based fares is I would generally implement at any point in time with a public transport type of service. Another thing that we look at is making sure that anything that we can do to make the payment mechanism simpler is going to help you as well. So what am I talking about there? Traditionally, we allow payment to happen through the app through a credit or a debit card, but we can also implement other payment methods such as a tap and go facility that's on board the vehicle, or we might start to integrate our actual payment solution in with the public transport solution. So that's something that I've seen happen here in New South Wales and Australia, where a customer firstly could use their Opal card, which is like the payment token for public transport, as a means of paying for on-demand. And then that was, I guess, taken to the next level with something called Opal Connect, where they're now actually able to use an account-based ticketing system that allows an integration and sharing of information so that when they pay for their on-demand service and then go onwards and use a public transport such as a train, they actually benefit from the overall fare benefits of the entire public transport system. Now that total integration, what we saw happen there is we saw the number of people who are using the service increase. That was great, But the other important thing is that our current customer base, they started to use the service even more, which is what you want them to do. You want them to see on-demand transport as the everyday choice and not just a by exception choice, particularly for a first and last mile type of solution. So those are some things to take into consideration when you're thinking about fears, as fears send strong signals. Now, when we talk about more of maybe a private or commercial one, where I would start is looking at what is your target customer cohort's next best alternative. Are you trying to convince people to move out of their car to this form of transport? Are they currently using a taxi or another form of ride sharing? Are they not traveling at all? And so understanding what their alternative is will help you design what an appropriate fare is. You can actually run some good, I guess, simulations where you might run multiple fares for different customer cohorts and take the data and the feedback from them, which will tell you what an appropriate fare is, and then you can adjust it accordingly. Another good thing that you can do with on-demand as well is that you can actually set different fares depending on the time of day. So you might have a fare incentive, which is a lower fare during the middle of the day to boost patronage, or maybe at the end of the day. You also might encourage people to use the service more regularly by bringing a subscription type model, which we'll get to with fare incentives. So there's a number of things to get taken into account with fares. I hope some of those principles will guide you in making the right decision. Now, once we've established a base fare, we shouldn't just think that's a set and forget situation, because we can do many promotions that will help us to build a cohort of passengers to begin with, and then also to increase it continually. When we first launch a service, one thing that we should realize is that it takes time and effort for people to try something new. This is sometimes called loss aversion, which is the idea that people might not want to do something because they're scared of losing out, particularly if there's a cost involved. And so we need to compensate them for that. So I'd suggest when we launch any new service that we have, say, the first 2 rides are free, or that maybe the first month is free. It's kind of the Netflix or Disney Plus model, where we say, let's give them something free so that they just do it. They just get on and they start using the service. And then they're like, hey, this is great, this is fantastic. And we start to get an early behavioral change. And then that becomes normalized in their behavior. And then when they start to have to pay for it, as much as that's a bit of pain, they're now scared of losing that service that they really like. It's the reason that now I have, I think, 4 subscriptions for 4 different streaming services. I can't give any of them up, or at least my kids won't let me do it. And so maybe having even a 2 weeks or a 4-week fare-free period will help you to establish that behavior. Now, some people say, oh, that's a lot of lost revenue, Ben. And I would counter that by saying, well, if you're never going to get that customer at all, you haven't really lost any revenue. And in fact, it's a very cost-effective way of boosting patronage to begin with, and creating that cohort that's then going to go on. Now, once you have that cohort, what do you want them to do? You want them to go and tell their friends and family. So that's where we bring like a promotional activity where, hey, you get a promotional code, go and tell your friends and family. When they use the on-demand service, they get their 2 free rides, but you also benefit by getting some free rides. And again, it's a very cost-effective way of marketing. There's a few other ways we can do. Like I said, discounted rides, maybe for the middle of the day. That helps us to balance out the patronage where we need to. And also, I said, a subscription model can be a really interesting way of getting people to use it regularly. If you can convince them to pay X amount of money per week or per month, you're going to find that those people are using the service on a very regular basis. So look, the next area that we want to start to cover is talking about more generalized the marketing. And there's 3, I guess, key areas that we focus on the marketing. Firstly, it's about acquiring new customers. Then it's about making sure that we actually activate them and they use the service. And then it's about continually engaging with them so they use the service on a regular basis, and hopefully share it with your friends and family. So there's a number of things that we can do to acquire customers. Firstly, it's about making sure that people are aware of it. Now, we can do this through media releases, having a great website that we direct people to it. It's about having social media posts, creating its own Facebook page and create a following there. One great way I've seen happening is just the vehicles moving around the community, even before the service has started. For the first 2 weeks before a service starts, have it going about great sharp livery, a call to action on the vehicle so they can download the app, get information, get directed to a website, start to get some interest going. And that really helps because it gets media interest as well, which is effectively free advertising. Something else that is helpful is to have appropriate wayfinding signs, particularly at key areas, say as a shopping mall or a train station. It acts as a place that people know they can go to wait for the vehicle, and they're standing in the right place, but it acts as continual advertising for the service as well. We've talked about some of the fare incentives we can use, but also having a launch activity. I've been to some great launch activities with balloons and cakes and the local mayor or the local politician, And again, inviting the media to come along, you get free write-ups. It can get social media coverage as well. It's a really cost-effective way of getting the service off the ground. It's a really great way of getting the drivers as well as excited about using the service and coming along to it as well. And then it's about starting to build some partnerships with those groups of people will start to tell their friends and family. That's why it's good to engage with community groups, whether it's like the Rotary Club or maybe a retirement village, and they start to tell their networks as well about the service. And that happens on a continual basis without you having to put in any additional work.
So Ben, sorry, just to quickly interrupt. I've got a question here that's come through from Megan, and her question is, how do you measure the effectiveness of these acquisition programs that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Megan. There's a couple of ways I'd suggest it. The first way, I'd definitely look at your app downloads, because it's a really good way of measuring client acquisition, customer acquisition, because now we have them, and importantly, when they register for the service, we have their email, and it creates a form of actual communication on an ongoing basis. So I'd really get as many people as possible to download the app. That's why one of the things, and when we talk about, I guess, a little bit more on the engagement side, is if I'm deploying a service which is, say, close to a train station or a shopping center, I like to put street teams out there, a couple of friendly faces, lots of energy that will talk to the public about the service, share them a leaflet, and importantly, get them to download the app there and then, so it's on their phone, maybe get them to register for it. It's a really effective way of building a customer base. Another way that I see people acquiring customers and getting good feedback is through targeted social media campaigns. Look, it's not for every service. It depends on what type of customer cohort you're going for. Obviously, a younger generation is probably going to respond better to it. But one of the good things about using that is that you get good diagnostics, good analytics coming back from it in terms of how many views, how many click-throughs, how many registrations come from that. So it can be another good way to measure that. So look, we've talked about, I guess, getting our customer, and now it's about activating them. Just because someone downloads the app doesn't mean they're actually going to use the service. And what we find is that we have a couple of groups of people. We'll have people that will download the app and they won't use the service. And we can go through email campaigns or in-app notifications to remind them about the service, sometimes even incentivizing them further to use the service for the first few times. Again, one of the reasons they might not use it is this loss aversion, and we need to overcome that. But we also might have people that use the service maybe a couple of times and then don't come back. And again, we might wait 3 or 4 weeks and then reach out to them again saying, hey, we noticed you haven't used the service again, come try it again for free. Or we might even do a little survey with that cohort of group to understand why is it that they've used the service a couple of times and not come back. And that can provide some really interesting feedback that can help us, and we'll get to this later on today, about diagnosing and about adjusting the service to actually meet those needs. And so this is a few ways that we can actually start to activate our customers. Another way is that we can start to test some strategies with different target audiences. So we might actually say, hey, with this target audience, let's reduce the walking distance and see if that increases the frequency of them using the service. What type of impact does it have? And we might be able to prove that reducing walking distances increases utilization or ridership, and that might justify us being able to actually put more vehicles on, which will allow that reduced walking distance to permeate across an entire service zone as well. And then we want to shift them to being engaged in the service and actually sharing it with their friends and family. And that can be really important because, again, that's effectively a free form of marketing that our customers are doing for us. So one way we can do that, we can see our top riders, those who are using it frequently, reach out to them, encourage them, potentially even incentivize them to tell their friends and family, tell them about the new benefits of it. It might be a new functionality that's been brought in. It might be some other type of technology that's been brought in to use the service. We might have newer vehicles that are coming on board, but make sure that they feel that they're part of the service so that they feel embedded into what's going on and that they have a way of influencing the service. And again, by doing this, we might start to identify some gaps in commuting behavior, and therefore we can start to target some communication channels or maybe even some promotions that are meeting those particular needs. So it might be people that we want people to use it in the evening, and so we actually target and incentivize people to use the service at those times of day. So again, there's no one right way of doing it. There's just a number of tools and dials and levers that we have at our disposal. Now, talking of tools and levers and dials, this is where monitoring and calibrating the service comes in. So at all points in time, you want to know how your customers are using the service. And I've always said that you will know more about your on-demand customer than any other form of customer you've got. And so you start to calibrate and understand that service based on that feedback. You look at utilization rates, average detour times, the offer rate, the offer acceptance rate, and you can start to see some trends and some ideas coming through that allow you to change the service. And again, it might be we need to extend our operational hours. We can see that people want to use it later on in the day. We might need to increase our supply of vehicles because our demand has exceeded what we originally anticipated. We might also realize that we need to change the type of on-demand service we've been implementing. Maybe we started off as a door-to-door service, but now maybe we need to change to implementing some more virtual bus stops, encouraging people to walk distances so we can aggregate demand more effectively. We take the data based on those decisions, we see what it's telling us, and then we review and we flow it back again. So it's a feedback loop that's happening at all points in time.
Ben, I've got a question here from Peter, and he's asking whether or not the average wait time differs based on either the use case or the cohort of rider that we're targeting.
Yeah, it definitely can, and I'd strongly suggest that you do that when you design the service. You take that into consideration. So a classic example is a service that in the morning is trying to move people from their homes to a transit hub, to a train, to a bus, and those people are trying to get to work. At that point of the time of the day, those customers are very time poor. They want to get to work by a certain time, and so the average wait time needs to reflect that particular need. So at that point in time, we probably say an average wait time between 6 to 10 minutes is probably going to be an acceptable average. But once it clicks over to say 9 o'clock, we have a different cohort of users, and they don't need such a timely response. They might be going to the shops or somewhere else, and we find that average wait times can easily start to go up to more averages of 12 to 14 minutes without any change in satisfaction levels from that customer cohort. We then flip it over back to 4 or 5 o'clock, we start to get some of those customers coming back. Again, we probably want to lower average wait times, but it's not as harsh, to be fair, as in the morning time. People are a little bit more flexible in the afternoon. If they get an average wait time of say 12 minutes and they're at work, I'll just finish up a couple more emails and they don't have an issue with that. So it's really important to understand each customer cohort and design the service for them. And again, it's that ability to chop and change it throughout the time of day, or again, even on the weekend, we might be able to change the parameters because people are less time sensitive.
And sorry, another question from Peter, and he's asking, does that same methodology apply for rural and regional areas?
It does in general, but again, it's understanding that customer cohort. So I've had experience with rural and regional services where customers were quite happy to wait up to half an hour because their next best or their previous alternative was a route bus that was on a 2-hour cycle. So again, it's understanding that 30 minutes might sound terrible, but from the customer's point of view, that's fine, especially if we're picking up close to their home. They ring up and say, I'd like to go down to the shop. Sure, we'll pick you up in 28 minutes. Okay, that's fine. I'll keep on doing what I'm doing at home. It's no big deal. And so it's just understanding that. Again, it might be a little bit different when they say want to return from the shops. That's where maybe we want to consider, we want to give people shorter wait times when they're coming back from the shops. They might have groceries to just purchase. They want to get home. They don't want their frozen foods to melt. So all these considerations can be accounted for.
Great, thanks, Ben.
So look, that's probably brought us to the end of episode 3. We've covered some really critical information. If you go back, we now covered both from episode 1 in terms of designing the service, and then episode 2 about deploying the service. And each one you can see there's many decisions to be made, and each one is influencing the way that service will be designed and the way that customers will interact with it. And it's really important to understand what is it that a customer is going to value, what's going to make them want to use the service, and you've got to couple that with what's going to make the service most efficient as well. And getting that balance right is important. It's about designing the service right at the beginning, and then after we've deployed the service, marketing and promoting the service as much as possible to make them aware of it and make them engage in the service, and then using the data that will be flowing freely back to you to maybe making those other iterations, those other adjustments, just to make that service even better than it was on day 1.
Great, thanks, Ben. In episode 3, which is slated for the end of April, we have Busways coming in to talk about their on-demand cooey service that operates in Sydney, Australia. They're going to tell their real-life experience from a feasibility study through to service design, and then efficiently launching their service and optimizing the service based on the data that they're able to receive from that service. It is important to note that that QE service, it has been one of the fastest growing on-demand public transport services that we've seen here at VIA. So it's going to be a really interesting session. Hope that you can join us. Again, if you've got any last minute questions, don't hesitate to put those in the box. I appreciate the time that you've had today. I hope you've taken some valuable insights from the session with Ben. Thank you, Ben. And I look forward to seeing you guys next time. Thank you.